So, Mr. Sorensen, the first question we wanted to ask you was if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship to Thompson and also, his relationship to Kennedy that you were able to observe.
Certainly. John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. One of the reasons he ran for president was because at the height of the Cold War, he was fearful that the foreign policy that prevailed before that of John Foster Dulles, called massive retaliation, might only lead to nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
Your father, Llewellyn Thompson, who had been U.S. ambassador in Moscow during those late 1950s years, was, I'm quite certain, a career Foreign Service officer.
That's correct.
Who was appointed, I'm not sure what his title was, counselor or what his title was. Maybe he was ambassador at large in the State Department. And when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke, and more details are available in my new book, which probably isn't on sale in Spain yet, called Counselor, A Life at the Edge of History. The Cuban Missile Crisis broke on October 16, the first of 13 memorable days of 1962. Historians still call them the 13 most dangerous days in the history of mankind, because a misstep, a wrong move, could have started a war which would have turned very quickly into a nuclear exchange. And if the first step were Soviets firing tactical nuclear weapons, the United States would have responded at least with tactical nuclear weapons. And once both sides were on that nuclear escalator, they would have moved up to strategic weapons and then to all-out warfare. And the scientists say the explosion of so many large nuclear weapons in both Eastern Europe and North America would have produced, in addition to the bombardment of hundreds of thousands and millions of people in both countries, would have resulted in radioactive poisoning of the atmosphere and in time of every other dimension of our planet, and would be spread by wind and water and even soil to the far reaches of the planet until that planet was uninhabitable. No plant life, no animal life, no human life, and you and I wouldn't be talking today.
Right now, yeah.
But fortunately, Kennedy, on that first day, October 16, decided not to convene the National Security Council, whose members are designated by statute and included some people whom he didn't think could keep a secret or were all that valuable in their advice anyway. He called together about a dozen or so of us, and one of them was your father, Llewellyn Thompson. After all, he knew Khrushchev, and I was told that had actually vacationed with the Khrushchevs, or maybe both Llewellyn and I don't know whether Jane, was that her name?
Yes.
Well, was she your mother, or was that none of my business? But anyway.
No, that's our mother. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, extremely nice lady. Extremely nice lady. I remember her too. Anyway, that the word was that they had vacationed with the Khrushchevs, and so there was a man who understood Khrushchev. And during that first week, until the president made his speech to the country, which was delivered to Khrushchev as well as every other leader in the world on the evening of October 22nd, we were sitting around a table, those of us in the so-called ExCom, which is a name that means Executive Committee of the National Security Council, but it was a name made up for the occasion, so we would have a name. There was no such thing called as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. And the path chosen by Kennedy ultimately was the prudent path of a blockade around Cuba, which we called a quarantine, because a blockade can be an act of war itself. And we were quarantining out, we said, not food and gasoline and medicine. We weren't trying to destroy the Cuban economy. We were quarantining out military equipment, offensive weapons, and so on. And there was a very, very tense week. Some communications, some attempt by the Secretary General of the UN to get the two sides to stand still. And ultimately, on Friday evening, October 26th, a long, somewhat rambling letter came in from Khrushchev.
And that was the trollop ploy thing, right?
Yes, that is, the trollop ploy was the next day, because a second letter came in, which was much tougher, more direct, sounded like it had been written by the Central Committee instead of the first one, which sounded like it had been written by Khrushchev itself. And so when a lot of other very dangerous and threatening things were going on Saturday the 27th, we were sitting around the cabinet table in the cabinet room in the West Wing, and wondering what could we do, what should we do, there were some glimmers of hope in that first letter, but they were pretty much dashed by the second. And it was your father who said, I suggest we ignore the second letter and answer the first. And Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and I immediately said we thought that was a good idea. That was the best way to do it. And the President directed us to draft that letter in reply. And we did, and ignored the second letter, except to say, once this crisis is settled, then other possible disarmament or peace moves can be discussed. And the next day, for a variety of reasons, Khrushchev decided to pull out the missiles under UN inspection, and the crisis ended. And I think your father deserves a great deal of the credit for that. And I remember him very well, a very wise, prudent man, just like President of the United States was a wise, prudent man who recognized it in others, and had it not been for that peaceful resolution which your father's advice made possible, as I say, maybe none of us would be here today.
I wonder if I could...
Absolutely amazing experience to live through.
Yes, it was.
It must have been amazing.
I can tell you, I'm told that today the cabinet room is a reinforced concrete shelter. It wasn't then. And if the Soviets then had so-called smart missiles that were as smart as our smart missiles, they knew our address. And we wouldn't have been sitting there much longer either.
No, but you mentioned that there was more than, in your book you mentioned there was more than one blockade. do you remember, version of the blockade proposed? Do you remember what Thompson's was, or did Thompson have an opinion on that?
I don't. I think that we may be misunderstanding each other a little bit here. I don't think I said there was more than one blockade.
I'm sorry. Different scenarios proposed before they decided which one to have.
Oh, different scenarios. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. The initial scenario was a bombing attack by the United States on the missiles.
Mm-hmm.
And in time, during that first week, as other options and pros and cons were brought forth, we divided into two groups on the XCOM. One was the group that stuck with the original harsh response, which would have been to bomb the missile sites. And we now know, which we didn't at the time, that the Soviets had tactical nuclear weapons on the island, and had there been any military attack by the United States from land, sea, or air, they would have responded by using those nuclear weapons. Khrushchev had even given them authority to use them on their own in the event of an attack.
But I thought there was
I'm saying all this just because the second group favored the blockade, which evolved into the quarantine. The first group favored the airstrike, which was to be followed by an invasion. And to the extent that we divided into two groups, Tommy Thompson was clearly in the blockade quarantine group, not in the airstrike group.
Mr. Sorensen, in your book, you talk about how you were developing the two different speeches, or asked to develop.
Oh, that's a different question. Yes. That's because. No, you're mixing that up with the movie. In the movie, they asked me about the second speech, and I said I couldn't write that one.
Yes, you had talked about in Counselor. You said that it was very difficult to write or impossible to write the airstrike speech, but that to include everything that the various executive committee members wanted in it. And we were just curious that the blockade speech, it seemed like it kind of formed as you were writing it and asking questions about it. Did the XCOM members also give you, make requirements that they wanted included in the quarantine?
Oh, of course, because when I started writing the blockade speech, a lot of questions came up. How is the blockade going to help? How is the blockade going to get missiles out of there? How is it going to bring the Soviets to the table, et cetera, et cetera? And I went back, and the blockade group convened again, and I asked those questions. They were answered. I apologize that I don't remember specific answers from specific members of our group, but I'm sure that Ambassador Thompson was one of the most helpful at that session also. But I never did write the second speech. What I did try to write earlier in the week was a message to Khrushchev to be delivered by a high-level emissary, warning him that we were going to bomb the missile sites. And that was a very difficult note to write. And somebody took that note and converted it into a second speech just in case Kennedy, in the key decision-making meeting of Saturday, October 20, if he decided on the airstrike approach, he would need a speech, and so they converted my note into a speech. Thank God that was never used.
Yeah.
Indeed. Also, jumping it just a little bit, at one point, I think in the decision-making in the White House, and then also through the Hux-K conference, several people, and I think you were also quoted as saying that Sovietologists were convinced that the Soviets would not put missiles outside of the Soviet Union. Did that include our father? And if so, we'd like to find that and be able to cite it, or?
Not to my knowledge, it didn't. But the Soviets had never previously put nuclear weapons outside their own borders. They were very secret. They were very dangerous. And so I think no one thought they ever would put them outside their borders, and certainly not put them on Cuba, which was defiantly close to the United States and run by a man who was, to say the least, unpredictable.
Yeah. I wonder if
no one thought. Everyone was astonished, and it was a secret pretty well kept by Khrushchev and his people.
Yeah. In the book Counselor, you mentioned that Thompson was present at the Oval Office meeting before Bobby Kennedy went to see Dobrynin. And,
did I? I'd forgotten that, but that's. I'm glad you reminded me. That's very, very important, because after the letter had been finished and approved, JFK called. Are you sure he was in? Did I say that he was in that meeting?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, JFK.
You said that Thompson was invaluable in helping Bobby prepare to go see Dobrynin. I wondered if you could tell us in what way, or what was his input in that meeting. What did he do? My memory is not that clear. I remember that. Both the President and Secretary of State Rusk and Secretary of Defense McNamara were in that meeting, so were Bundy and I. And I'd forgotten, I'm ashamed to say, that Thompson was in that meeting. Essentially, Bobby was being told to be, on the one hand, flexible about the fact that our missiles in Turkey would not be there much longer for the reasons I explained. They were still there in October of '62 only because Kennedy's decision a year earlier that they come out had been ignored by the Defense Department, or maybe resistance from NATO and the Turks. And he was also urged to be very direct, and everybody felt that Dobrynin would convey a message to Khrushchev, which we hoped he would take seriously, but also feel that there was some face-saving in that kind of resolution, and that's where the wisdom of Ambassador Thompson, who knew Khrushchev and knew what was important to him, would favorably respond.
Leaving the Cuban Missile Crisis for a moment, in your book on Kennedy, I think it was titled Kennedy, you wrote, Kennedy noted Khrushchev shared his own complaints of internal pressures from military, other politicians, and associate countries. And it struck us because as we're trying to understand the Cold War, if anybody can, and know what our father's role was in it, we keep running across this theme of currents of obstruction, and that quote kind of struck us, and we're wondering, how are we on the right track here? How deep did they run, and were they?
You mean inside the Kremlin?
No, I mean in our own government.
Oh, in our own government.
Certainly they were inside the Kremlin.
I'll say they did.
Yeah.
I mean, when Kennedy, and at that time I knew less about those obstructions than I subsequently learned from, and I hope you've had a chance to look at the book called The White House Tapes by May and Zelikow.
Yes.
And that is where, for the first time, I saw the transcription of the president's meeting with the Joint Chiefs. And that you get a taste of, in that meeting, of how bitterly opposed, General LeMay and others were, to any kind of peaceful resolution. And even some of the leaders of Congress whom Kennedy convened in that same cabinet room just before he went on the air on the evening of October 22. And many leaders of both parties thought that the blockade was too soft a response, and that we ought to, as one congressional leader said, go in there and hit them with everything we have.
Yeah.
Kind of frightening to see parallels today, but yeah.
Exactly.
In the Kennedy tapes, in that book, actually, we ran across an unusual meeting later on where Thompson was, President Kennedy asked him to come in it he asked about the fallout from the U-2 affair and the failed Paris summit. And Kennedy was wondering if the summit had been intentionally torpedoed. And that happens to be a sort of a section that we're working on at the moment, and I was just curious whether you ever heard President Kennedy speculate on what had gone wrong in Paris and what happened as a result of the U-2 affair.
No, I'm sorry to say I don't remember that I ever did.
Okay. We just thought it was an odd...
But you're going to have a fascinating book.
If we ever dig up everything.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could, we could go to that Vienna summit, between Kennedy and Khrushchev. You
by
said
coincidence, let me just tell you, by coincidence, a week ago I received a letter from some study research group, maybe a university, maybe a foreign policy organization, whatever, in Vienna, saying that next year they're going to commemorate the 50th anniversary.
Yes, I heard about that. Yes.
Oh, you did good, because they want me to speak, and they also want me to write an essay with my recollections of the summit, and I'm in the process of just finishing that essay now, and I have done zero additional research. I'm just drawing on my own memory and books, and I assume that Ambassador Thompson attended that summit.
Yes, he was there.
Either in his... Was he still? He may have still been ambassador to Moscow.
That's right, and that's right, and he came to the meeting, and well, as you know, there's people who say that Kennedy was totally devastated at that meeting. Others that say he wasn't. Thompson, in his oral history, says that Kennedy wasn't.
I'm certainly glad to hear that, because that's what I'm saying in my essay. I point out that others said that Kennedy was humiliated and bullied, and that I actually read the transcript.
Where could we get a hold of that transcript? Because we only have been able to find, somebody's, people sort of discussing what was said, but not an actual transcript.
Well, I'll tell you a secret. In my book, Kennedy, which you have, I discuss that summit and what each side said about Berlin. And just between you and me, I took out the quotation marks because I didn't think I'd get away with it. But that is the actual...
oh, great.
Most of that comes from the actual transcript.
Yeah.
And is that transcript...
thorough that we've been able to find.
Is the transcript available?
The Kennedy Library, A, probably has the transcript. B, surely would... make it available to the daughters of one of the key advisors and participants, and you can tell them I said so.
Okay, thank you. We'll do that. Well, that would be great if you go to this we're trying to get an invitation to this conference in Vienna.
That'd be good.
We would like to go.
Can
because
I ask
it would be interesting.
Personal question. How old are you ladies?
I'm 60, and Sherry.
Oh, I don't believe it. You have a voice of a 30-year-old.
Thank you. That's about all I have of a 30-year-old.
And I'm 56.
Well, I'd be happy to, assuming I lived long enough to go to that conference, I'd be delighted to see you there.
Well, let's hope that we can make it. So, so your personal impression, did you notice Thompson there at the Vienna summit? Did you have any dealings with him there, or?
Not that I remember. Sorry.
Okay.
Also, at that meeting, clearly the Vienna meeting was not a negotiating session, and
that is what it was not supposed to be a negotiating session. And Kennedy, therefore, didn't bring any specific plans and proposals, but he had been very well briefed on Berlin because he did know in advance that was at the top of Khrushchev's agenda. Okay. And I am willing to bet you that in the archives somewhere there's one or more cables from, whatever the code word was for Moscow U.S. Embassy to Kennedy at the White House, in which Thompson gave his advice on what Kennedy might expect. You also might want to check out to see if he was involved in the proposed debate between Kennedy and Khrushchev on international, as they had in mind, for world television. Pierre Salinger was one of our negotiators on that, and in his memoirs, he may very well talk a little bit about it and whether your father participated in those, or at least advised on those negotiations also.
That's interesting. That's a good lead. That never happened, though. I guess the closest it came was the Ajube interview.
Which itself was very important.
Indeed. And this is sort of you brought up Berlin, and this is kind of an out of the blue question, but as we're looking at Berlin, it keeps coming to my mind. Why not a united neutral Germany? Was that ever considered? Or was that completely off the table, out of the question?
I think that it's an idea that was probably floating around, but I think that given the Cold War attitudes on both sides at that time, that neither the West nor the Soviets would have trusted such a solution, and the West Germans would have considered it a sellout. Adenauer, who was then the Chancellor of West Germany, would have been outraged and denounced the West as unwilling to stand up for freedom. So probably the honest answer is it was not seriously considered.
Yeah. I just want to go back for a second to the Cuban Missile Crisis. You said that Kennedy received, Atchison wanted Kennedy to declare a state of emergency, and that
No, now you're mixing them up. That was the Berlin crisis.
That was over the Berlin crisis?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And then and that Kennedy said that he received a cable from the embassy in Moscow saying that the Soviets were likely to be more impressed by substantial quiet moves that didn't panic the Allies.
Yes, but no, you're right. That was that was Berlin. Correct.
Yes, that was Berlin, yes. Would that have been Thompson? Probably, yes, no?
What was the actual date of his transfer from Moscow to Washington?
He left in 62. Well, he left in, beginning of 62, I think.
The summer of 62.
I think that sounds right, and therefore, yes, if in fact that advice came from Moscow, and it probably did, I think that was Thompson, yes.
It does sound like something he would say.
Yes, it is, and I think that was another very important contribution he made.
Okay. The other thing, in Thompson's oral history, he mentions that he went, or the interviewer who is interviewing Thompson, he says that Thompson went to Hyannisport in 1963 when Maxwell Taylor also happened to be there. And he was asked if this was just a social call or was he doing anything else there. And Thompson, he just never really would talk about anything that he thought shouldn't be talked about. And he said that no, they were just discussing the budget and he really wasn't involved. Do you have any idea what he might have been discussing with Kennedy and Hyannisport at that time?
I had forgotten the year, but I do remember there was a very high-level meeting in Hyannisport on several issues. I thought it was 1961 or 2. Mm-hmm. But in 63, you don't know the date in 63, do you?
No, the interviewer just said that. I think Sherry and I are trying to figure out when that could have been. It was could have been in the summer of 63?
Well, bear in mind that the late summer of 63 and fall of 63 was when the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which Kennedy had first talked about in his American University commencement address of June 10, mm-hmm. was, and then Khrushchev had invited the negotiators to come to Moscow and work one out. And, of course, Kennedy had to figure out how to get the Joint Chiefs to testify in favor of it before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a few internal political legislative moves like that. And that may very well have been one of the subjects, although I think the budget was actually a subject of the meeting also that was held at Hyannisport.
Mm-hmm. But in the 61 or 62 meetings, was Thompson also, did you see him at Hyannisport often, or?
Not to my recollection.
Yeah, I think it was just that once.
Just that one time.
That must have been quite a sales pitch for the Joint Chiefs at that time, especially after that kind of bait and switch that Khrushchev pulled earlier with the nuclear test, but saying he would not do atmospheric tests or would not be the first, and then did it anyway.
That's true.
Kennedy picked Harriman to go and actually do the sort of the signing, or the last.
Harriman was the chief of the delegation.
Mm-hmm. Do you know any reason why they didn't pick Thompson to do that?
None at all.
Mm-hmm.
Harriman was a more senior diplomat at that point, I suppose.
Well, that's true, and I'm quite certain that Carl Kaysen, who was the deputy national security advisor, was there as the White House representative. And I know that Kennedy added a couple of Republican senators to increase the bipartisan credibility of that delegation. But if you want me to tell you something very frankly, off the record, don't quote, in other words, not for attribution.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sure of that, which demonstrates that Thompson was a loyal bureaucrat going through the proper channels.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Ruska.
But I'll also be frank to say he was a lot more valuable in the ex-com meetings than Rusk.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you'll notice in one or both my books, when Kennedy absented himself for a day, Wednesday the 18th, to make a campaign appearance, when he came back, I said to him that I thought many of the participants in the ex-com were better and franker in their advice, which might differ from their senior secretary's advice when the president wasn't there.
Yeah,
I'm sure that Thompson was one of those I had in mind when I told the president that, and for that reason he had absented himself deliberately from some of our planning meetings during that first week.
Well, that's interesting, yeah. You mentioned the American University speech, and in Thompson's oral history, he said that he thought it was you. He wasn't sure. Called him at one point to discuss that speech. Do you remember calling him or talking to him, or what his input was for it, or?
Well, if it was, no. I'll say there are two possibilities of calls he got. One is that my first draft of the speech I ran by National Security Advisor George Bundy, and he brought a couple of other people in to review it. But after I flew it out to Hawaii, and the president reviewed it on the long trip back from Hawaii, he said to Bundy, and I assume to me at the same time, I don't want this speech cleared with the State Department, Defense Department, CIA, and knowing Kennedy's high regard for Thompson, he might very well have said, accept Thompson, because he's the one person around who will agree with it. And it's possible, therefore, that he asked me to call Thompson from the plane, but I don't remember calling him while the speech was in preparation, and I certainly had no time to call him once we got back home.
That makes sense, because when he described it, he didn't make it sound like it was, still being drafted. It was just kind of running it by him, and I think that speech was one that he not only agreed with, but was heartedly in favor of. It must have been a great joy for him to hear his president make that speech.
Well, I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that he had at least an indirect influence on me and the president in the thinking about that speech.
Because those ideas were kind of knocked around, I suppose, for a while, no?
Not much, to be honest with you. This sounds immodest, but I was very much on my own when the president was on his trip to Hawaii, and that speech, more than any other, reflects my thinking and where we were at that time.
Yeah, it's too bad it all fell apart.
No, it didn't.
Well,
we're still here, aren't we?
Yeah, we're here, but it doesn't.
Hanging on with our fingernails.
Yeah, it really looks scary. It looks a lot scarier now than I think it did back then.
Oh, no.
No?
Not scarier than it looked during 13 days of October.
Well, that I'm sure.
That's true.
I'm sure.
I think we've come to pretty much the end of our questions, but we were wondering...
Those are good questions, and you ladies are on a very important project for history.
Well, if you can think of anything else that you think that we should know about or we should include or that you think would be, necessary. My two books, I mentioned other subjects that I had less involvement in, and I simply don't know how much involvement Thompson might have had. One was the hotline between Moscow and Washington. Another was an agreement, probably at the United Nations, to keep weapons of mass destruction out of outer space. Another, which I did have some involvement in, was the sale of American wheat to Russia. These are all 1963 that I'm talking about.
And then there was Kennedy's speech to the United Nations General Assembly in September, I think, of '63, in which he listed a number of areas where he thought there might be cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Those are good leads, yes.
Well, did you notice, or were you witness to any, relationship between Thompson and Bobby Kennedy? Was that anything that you observed, you could see, or?
Clearly, they were congenial and compatible during the Cuban Missile Crisis, sitting around that table. But you ought to take a look at Bobby's book, 13 Days, because I have a vague recollection that he had high praise for Thompson in that book.
Yes, he did.
And you might see whether Bobby's oral history has anything like that.
Okay. And what about your personal relationship with Thompson? Did you have any relationship outside of the 13 days?
Not that I can remember offhand, except that in somewhere after I had left the White House, and now we're talking about probably late '64, '65, there was a very, very fancy ball hosted by Kay Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, called the Black and White Ball or something like that in honor of Truman Capote in New York. I attended, and I have a distinct recollection of dancing with your mother.
Yeah, well, she did like to dance, yeah.
Well, she was a very pretty lady.
Yeah, I remember going to that party. That was.
Yeah, I remember that too. I think it must have been an incredible party. Yeah. So many that.
It was very fancy for a kid from Nebraska, I'll tell you that.
Well, yeah, I think it was fancy for the Thompsons too, but my mother wouldn't pass it up for anything.
Oh, good.
Well, Mr. Sorensen, I can't thank you enough for doing this. This is so kind of you to take this time.
Well, this all stemmed, somebody told me, because a couple of months ago, when after I spoke to some University of Pennsylvania students, David Eisenhower attended a dinner session, and I don't remember whether your father's name came up because he asked me, or whether it came up during the Q&A after my speech, but ultimately I was told he was in touch with one of you, and that's what led to the idea of a phone interview.
Yeah, actually, he was in touch with me because that's kind of a funny story, because when I was about 10 or 11, we were just leaving Moscow, and Eisenhower was in Copenhagen with his grandson David. And my father and Eisenhower met and introduced David and me, and we got into sort of an argument about whether Russians were good guys or bad guys, and I was defending the Russians, so. And I got in touch with David Eisenhower, and we were reminiscing about this, and then he mentioned that you had come to give a talk there, and I said, oh, well, we would really like to talk to him. So he said, well, I'll try to arrange it. So that's how it happened.
That's a nice story.
Well, in any case, if you could think of anything else or anything else you think we should know or include, we'd always, be very grateful to get it. It's
who were your father must have had some young aides who were still around.
He did. Yes. Unfortunately, his aide during the big tour in Moscow passed away.
Who was that?
That was Erdy. What's his name? Klein. Is that right, Jenny?
Yes, that's right, Mr. Klein. Yes.
No, I don't remember him, but there is somebody else who I do know, although I haven't seen him in several years. He was quite I still remember what he looked like. He was quite a dashing bachelor when I knew him here. He married a lady who for a while worked at CIA, but he told me he was in Moscow at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, your father wasn't there then, but he surely must have been there and known your father.
I wonder who that could have been.
I'll know the name when I hear it.
We were in touch with a number of younger people who were there at the time, and a gentleman by the name of Martins was kind enough to host a little get-together with some of them, and so it was Vladimir Tumanov and Hans
Tuck, would that have been the name?
I don't think
Who?
so. Then there was
Hans Tuck?
No, I don't know
that.
And then
well, it's not important. Not important.
Yeah.
But
Jonathan
I'm sure the between the department and the library, they can help you track some of those people down.
Yeah, probably wise to see if we can find any that were around then that we that didn't surface. Great.
All right, I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us.
So much.
Okay, my pleasure.
And hopefully we'll see you in Vienna.
That would be great. Okay, I look forward to that.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.